I'm going to read you a story I wrote quite a while ago, but it doesn't matter how old it is; it remains the same, basically. It's about a woman who supposedly suddenly burst into fire. It's called Murder, Accident, or the Miraculous. By the way, in researching this, for some reason I've yet to figure out. I have a lot of friends who are cops or firemen. So in speaking to the firemen, these are, by the way, seasoned firemen. They have advanced degrees in fire science and they hold some high rank. And so, and we have a lot of discussions about this. But uh, well, I'll talk about that later. I'm going to read a summary, a couple of chapters that I got from somewhere, and I'm sorry, I just don't know where I got it. A newspaper, perhaps, or a magazine article, but it's a good lead in and gives you a sound idea of where we're going with this. It says that in July of 1951, authorities found the body of 67-year-old Mary Reeser, Reeser, in her St. Petersburg apartment, St. Petersburg, Florida. Or, more accurately, the pile of mostly ash that had once been Mary Reeser's body, part of her lower leg and some of her spine. Apparently, her body had been almost entirely cremated, which is mind boggling when you consider that cremation requires 3 hours of burning in a 3,000-degree fire. Even more bizarre, I should say, even more bizarrely, but anyway, only Reese's body had been burned. The rest of the apartment was intact, even a pile of newspapers beside her body. So you've got two choices in this, the way I see it. By the way, this is called the Reeser case. It's probably the most well-known tale of spontaneous human combustion. Doesn't mean it's factual, it's just a well-known story of spontaneous human combustion. You've got two choices. One option is to believe that Mary Reeser suddenly exploded into a ball of flames for absolutely no reason. The other is to believe that Mary Reeser accidentally set herself on fire with a cigarette. So I'll give you a little bit more on this case. Just before 9 p.m., July 1, 1951, Mary Hardy Reeser, a widow, had walked her son, Dr. Richard Reeser Jr., to the door of her apartment. He had dropped by for a visit. After he left, Mary dressed in her nightgown and took two sleeping pills. I'll say that again, took two sleeping pills. She opened two windows in the apartment and sat in an overstuffed easy chair and lit her last cigarette of the night. I want to point out when I say she opened two windows, the firemen tell me this is crucial. She sat basically between the two open windows, one far off on the left, one far off on the right. For a cross breeze, that made sense. But fire-wise, we'll get into that. Several hours later, a neighbor smelled fire, phoned the police. Firefighters arrived very quickly. They found virtually nothing left of Mary Reeser. Most of her was reduced to a pile of black ash. Her backbone was more or less untouched, and that's, bear in mind, she was sitting now, so that explains why that was more or less untouched. And her left foot had a black slipper on it still. Her skull, firemen reported, was, quote, shrunken to the size of a cup. So St. Petersburg Police Chief J.R. Ricart requested help from the FBI in solving the case. The Bureau technicians spent 3 weeks going over this. It's a long time to do testing on it. They were only able to determine that there was no evidence to suggest lightning had struck Mary. It came in through an open window, as it often does, or it had struck the building. All the fuses throughout the building and in her apartment were intact. Investigators hadn't been able to detect substances that could have started the blaze. The FBI also ruled out spontaneous combustion, but did suggest that the overweight Mrs. Reeser, she stood just under 5 feet and weighed 175 pounds, 170 pounds. The fat could have fed a fire, her fat, that smoldered throughout the evening, allowing hot air and smoke to rise to the top of the room, but there were no smoke stains as in the amount there should have been had it burned for hours. You know? Although there are several hundred unconfirmed reports of people spontaneously combusting, there's never been a proven case of it, of spontaneous human combustion. There are, however, countless cases of people, and they're usually older people, accidentally setting themselves on fire with a cigarette or cigar or a pipe. Benjamin Radford, a science writer, deputy editor of the science magazine Skeptical Inquirer. I have a subscription to that. It's a great magazine if you're like me, you want to get to the bottom of something. You can read it online. and it's some reasonable price. It's called Skeptical Inquirer. It casts doubt on the plausibility of spontaneous human combustion. He says if SHC, spontaneous combustion, is a real phenomenon and not all the results of elderly or infirm persons being too close to a flame source, why doesn't it happen more often? There are 5 billion people in the world, and yet we don't see reports of people bursting into flames while walking down the street or attending a football game or sipping a coffee at your local Starbucks. It's a good argument. The phenomenon, spontaneous human combustion, if it exists at all, can be attributed to what's called the wick effect, whereby an external source of fire ignites nearby flammable material and human fat or other sources keep the fire going. In order for anything to combust, you need 3 things: very high heat, a source of fuel, an oxidizing agent. Uh, a source of fuel could have been Mrs. Reeser's nightgown, which was made of rayon, which is notorious for having, especially in those days, caught fire from a cigarette flame or an ash. The oxidizing agent was probably just the air. It was muggy in the apartment. One of the problems with the concept of spontaneous human combustion is that the human body is largely composed of water, so it's going to be difficult to burn. However, the fat in a human body will burn, and when it does burn, it could, I stress the word could, act as fuel once the fire from fat starts. As the fat melts, the body burns from the inside out. We're not used to that. We're used to seeing things burn from humans, unfortunately, burn from the inside, outside in. So leaving the surroundings intact. When it burns from the inside out, everything around the body is untouched. The victim's hair or clothing will act like a candle wick. It's known as the wick, and that's the wick effect. A BBC show called QED performed a similar experiment in 1998 with a pig body wrapped in a blanket and showed that the body burned for several hours without igniting its surrounding, burned internally, in other words, to the outside, from inside out. In 1928, a study of supposed human spontaneous combustion found some commonalities among the recorded cases. They included these following characteristics. The victims are chronic alcoholics. Mrs. Reeser had ingested sleeping pills, but who knows if she drank or not. There are usually older females. She was 67. The body had not been burned spontaneously, but some lighted substance had come into contact with it. Again, chain smoker. She smoked. She was a chain smoker, and she did have a cigarette when she sat down. The hands and the feet usually fall off the body when it burns, and that was the case in this Mrs. Reeser's death. The fire had caused very little damage to combustible things in contact with the body. The combustion of the body has left a residue of greasy ashes and a strong offensive odor, which it did in her case. A second study completed in the 1950s also found that the burned bodies were in close proximity to a plausible source of ignition, like a candle, a lamp, fireplace. And those are often omitted from published accounts of these incidences because I think people want to exaggerate. This guy suddenly caught fire and boom, and isn't that scary? And then a writer can leave out anything he wants, really. As well, guy, there were 4 fireplaces in the room. And if the writer wants to stick to the fantastic that this person just exploded for no reason, they'll just omit the fact that, they were inside a furnace with 4 fireplaces nearby. So the investigations also found that there was a correlation between alleged spontaneous human combustion deaths and the victim's intoxication level, which could have been caused them to respond improperly to an accident. So they're drunk, they've had too much, and then God knows they set themselves on fire somehow or caused the fire, and they're older, they've panicked, they're loaded, and they make dumb decisions. It's human nature. The reason the legs and the feet didn't burn in these study cases is that they usually weren't covered in clothing. And we know she had on her nightgown, so we don't know, maybe it went to her knees, and what was covered by clothing, her feet, but when they found her leg, It was covered with a moccasin. One of the
maybe
firemen I know who has studied fire science for a long time, he brought up a good point that in his experience, the reason things don't burn around an object that's on fire, in this case a human being, is because fire tends to burn upward, not sideways. Even in a breeze, fire will burn upward. That's where the oxygen is. It makes sense. There was a study in 2002 by Angie Christensen, University of Tennessee, on cremated bones, healthy and osteoporotic samples of human bone, meaning porous bone, where a disease might reduce the density and quality of a bone. This sort of thing is common in the elderly, and compared the resulting color changes and fragmentation. The study found that the diseased bones, for lack of the porous bones, samples were, quote, constantly displayed more discoloration and a greater degree of fragmentation than the healthy ones. So the same study found that when human tissue is burned, the resulting flame produces a small amount of heat, indicating that fire is unlikely to spread beyond the burning tissue, beyond the burning fat, for lack of a. Almost every case of supposed spontaneous human combustion that has been examined involves persons with low mobility due to advanced age or obesity, poor health. In Mrs. Reeser's case, she had taken sleeping pills, she was a smoker, she had a heart condition, and she was overweight. So, and it's late at night. She was tired. So cigarettes are most often the source of fire in 1 out of every 4 fire deaths in the United States. Let me read that again. Cigarettes are most often the cause of sources of fire in 1 out of every 4 fires deaths in the U.S. A common theory was that she, Mrs. Reeser, was smoking a cigarette. After taking the sleeping pills, she was late for her. She fell asleep still holding a cigarette in her hand, the burning cigarette in her hand, which would have ignited her gown, ultimately leading to her death. Mary, said Ernest Reeser, Mary Reeser's daughter-in-law, was a great smoker. The cigarette dropped to her lap. Her fat was the fuel that kept her burning. The floor was cement, and the chair was by itself. In other words, it wasn't near anything. There's nothing around it to burn. Oh, good point. There are several unanswered questions. For one thing, instead of shrinking, Mary Reeser's skull should have exploded, but it didn't. Also, a near cremation of the body would have required several thousand degrees over the course of several hours, and there wasn't. It's only fair to mention that there is one theory is that a condition called ketosis, the human body produces small amounts of flammable substance called acetone or acetone, a component of nail polish remover. A person who is ill may produce enough acetone that a tiny spark, say from static electricity, like from the sort of gown she was wearing, could cause the person to catch fire and burn. Yet there's another theory, this one's a little further out, is that the methane built up in the intestines may have ignited. So it's an interesting case. I honestly believe that she simply, with her, what she was wearing, that nightgown, flammable nightgown, basically, and the cigarette, the sleeping pills, she was late. She fell asleep and set herself on fire. But that's my opinion. Who knows what the